But an interesting thing with what we see with the symbology here is, again, that they're depicting them with wings. Now, again, archaeologists said that these were birdmen, and they didn't understand what they were seeing. Well, I make the symbolic reference of saying they were just showing that they had the power of flight. Because if we look at today's modern symbolic references for the power of flight, here we have Apollo 11, the first astronaut landing, and it's an eagle. Houston, the eagle has landed. I think even, right, we have this clip. Houston, the eagle has landed. Now, 6,000 years from now, I don't think people are going to look at the Apollo 11 patch and say, what were we doing, landing birds on the moon? No. We're just symbolically showing, right, that we had the power of flight. And it's the same thing that the Sumerians were saying for... We start to see the similarities. It makes sense that, what they were depicting wasn't that they actually had wings, it was to say that they had the power of flight. They didn't have any references for spacecraft or airplanes. The only thing flying again in the sky was something alive, a bird. So, the only reference point again is to say that all of these references for the power of flight from ancient cultures around the world, when put into the context of maybe they were witnessing something in the skies that they only had to reference in the knowledge base that they had, which was very simple terms. So now we jump into a term from the Sumerian information of if there was a great flood, what could have caused it, and what information do we have to support this type of a theory of a great deluge? Well, first of all, we have artifacts that show reference points or maps being drawn that there's really no explanation for the topography to have been mapped so accurately by ancient man. This is on a gazelle skin held by a Turkish admiral found in 1513, or thought to have been created roughly from earlier Mesopotamian sources, but it was originated in 1513 on this gazelle skin, and it shows parts of the continents, North and South America, still connected. And we have other maps that show this same type of topography of Antarctica, right, where it's basically covered in ice over a mile thick, and you can't see the actual landmass underneath the ice unless you're using ground-penetrating radar, which we have today, to see, this is the actual land continent versus the ice. Here it is on maps shown that there's no way they could have known the actual topography other than this was handed down to them by sources that say it came from Mesopotamian sources. Mesopotamia, Babylon, Sumer was the first civilization. So these sources again come from Sumerian influences of knowledge of maps and layouts for the continents that there's just no way they could have mapped this or known this without the aid of technology. So one of my favorite artifacts to show people is in the British Museum. There is on display the flood tablet, and it tells in a very primitive form of Akkadian script, very close to cuneiform script, a tale of how an Anunnaki, a Sumerian god, chooses a man called Utnapishtim, a Sumerian man, to build a craft and to take aboard all living things that he could find in the area, plants, animals, his family. But it's a tale that's echoed out in a stone version where, when the curator, it was actually an assistant curator to the British Museum, his name was George Smith, and when he found this tablet while doing an excavation, and I think it was early 1900s, he started to read and decipher this and threw his hands up in amazement and couldn't believe that here he has in stone an actual tale of the Noah's Ark. But it's in a Sumerian derivative that's thousands of years before any known tale, possibly the original form. So what's interesting about a lot of these Sumerian tablets, as we see here, this one, is there's actual physical evidence to show they have echoed biblical tales, just like the Genesis 7 days of creation. There are 7 tablets of creation that tell a much longer tale of how the Anunnaki came here 300,000 years ago, originally to mine gold in southern Africa. As the tale goes in the Sumerian text of how this was written, the Anunnaki came here to find precious gold and minerals to repair Nibiru's atmosphere. On the Anunnaki's own rise to a technological civilization on Nibiru led them to have atmospheric issues, holes in the ozone as it's described, where they would use gold to grind it up into a powder and patch their atmosphere by shooting this up into the atmosphere. Nibiru is known to be a very luminous, glowing planet. Many people have asked me over the years, how could life survive on Nibiru if it goes so far out into the solar system? Well, one of the theories is just like you are what you eat, or you're a product of your environment. If you're living on a gaseous, glowing planet, we do see natural luminescence here in fireflies and various other living creatures, where if the Anunnaki did live on a glowing planet, all these depictions we see of angels with this halo around them, the Anunnaki actually had a glow about them, that if one was to be standing in front of you, you would be like, he's got kind of a glow to him. So that tale, again, carried over of similarities of the depictions of the Anunnaki to our, what we would call angels, starts to take a physical reality when we find artifacts like this. Here's another interesting thing. There was once upon a time when there were giants upon the earth. So we have many depictions of Sumerians worshipping Anunnaki, and they are depicted as a much larger form. Now, I don't really think, because I haven't seen skeletons found or any evidence to point out that the Anunnaki were physically larger beings. I just think they were revered as, very great beings, and were depicted as, larger so that they would be more prominent. But it's a very interesting tale, again, when we hear these similarities and we see them in physical form from a culture that predates any of the tales found in the Old or New Testament. So one of the pinnacle points of the Sumerian tale is where the Anunnaki come from. They don't say, oh, they come from heaven. They say very specifically that the Anunnaki came from the 12th planet, Nibiru. And we would know that today as Planet X. Now, the reason why there's been controversy over the last few years is a lot of people have started to come into the idea of saying, wow, we see evidence for global changes, weather patterns changing, getting more catastrophic. We do support the idea that there was a great flood. What could have caused that great flood? Well, the Sumerians give us a very accurate tale of how this planet, Nibiru, is part of our creation of the solar system and planet Earth. And they have a very drawn-out text that explains how Nibiru, this ancient planet, billions of years ago, and now they describe it in the early times of when the planets hadn't finished becoming solid mass, probably hadn't finished coalescing, this intruder planet comes in, Nibiru, and gets sucked in by the gravitational pull of our outer planets and collides with our primitive Earth. Now we're talking 4 billion years ago, people, a long time ago. But they're saying that basically the Nibiru collided, or the moons of Nibiru collided with our primitive Earth, which was then called Tiamat, and pushed it into a new orbit, and in doing that collision, cracked it off, making the asteroid belt, moving us into a new orbit, and forever changing the makeup of the solar system. Now, the reason why this information is so interesting is, as I'll show you from the ancient sources, there's a lot of evidence to support not only the Anunnaki, but where they came from. Here's a cylinder seal rendition on a stone tablet that's roughly 45, almost 6,000 years old. And what's interesting about this is it's just basically the Sumerian God granting the Sumerians the plow, agriculture. But as a backdrop, you see a complete depiction of our solar system with the sun in the center and all the planets that we know of. Now, why this is so amazing is that through the times of Copernicus and Galileo, we thought we were the Earth was the center of the solar system. We didn't have any idea that we orbited the sun. Yet, a complete, accurate rendition 6,000 years ago on a Sumerian tablet. And they have a lot of information that not only supports what they say for a 12th planet, but as I described earlier, calling us the 7th planet and counting outward in, there's a lot of information that we can now confirm with our science between the distance of the planets, what they look like in space, all described by the Sumerians 6,000 years ago. Now again, when archaeologists were pulling these tablets out of ancient Iraq, in the early 1900s, we didn't discover Pluto until 1930. So talk of a 12th planet and the outer planets and birdmen, all of this information went into a big pile called the myth pile and has basically been untouched by modern archaeologists until over the last 30 or 40 years when people have started to have alternative theories to say, well, what if this isn't mythology? What if these stories are things that have actually taken place? So an artistic rendition, again, is just showing the Sumerian makeup of how they counted 12 planets, the 9 planets that we know of, plus our sun, our moon, and an additional planet, Nibiru, making the 12th planet. So they have a very interesting tale, as I was describing, of how this planet, they called it an intruder planet, came in and whacked our primitive Earth and forever changed the aspects of our solar system. Uranus is tilted on its side. Pluto and Neptune, they possibly think, were dislodged moons of Saturn, yet they don't know how this could be. How did they get into their current orbit? Well, a lot of this information is described by, or is put into play with an answer by including an unknown foreign body that came through and has disrupted our solar system. This, again, is the Sumerian information of how it got pulled in by the outer planets, had this collision with our primitive Earth, and then put us into a new orbit. Now, why this is so amazing is the asteroid belt is not enough to make up a planet. There's no real theory as to what caused or what is the asteroid belt, other than in the religious text, for instance, we have stories that, like in English, it's called the hammered out bracelet. And the Sumerians very specifically in their texts explain how all of this came into being with this additional planet, Nibiru, coming through the solar system. And when it did that, after whacking us 4.5 billion years ago, it thrust us into a new orbit so that it comes around once every 3,600 years through our inner solar system. So Nibiru, I think I have a slide here showing that. No, I guess I don't. Sorry. Well, Nibiru's orbit goes around the sun in a very elliptical orbit. We go around the sun once. A solar year for us is 365 days. One loop around the sun. One orbit for Nibiru is 3,600 of our years. Now, they call this a shar. They were the first ones to give 360 degrees of the circle, and they said Nibiru has a 3,600-year orbit, which they called a shar, a completed circle. Another interesting thing that I point out to people is that if the Anunnaki do exist and they live on Nibiru, a solar year for them is 3,600 of our years. One loop around the sun is a year. On Earth, it's 365 days. So, I hypothetically throw out there that if Jesus was an Anunnaki and he came here and he was 21 and said, "Hello, my people, I am here. Here's some laws and things you should live by to keep your body safe and have a good mind, and I will return." However means that he left. 3,600 years go by because he goes back on Nibiru, and it's just been a year for him. He goes around the sun once. He comes back a year later. It's been 3,600 years on Earth, but Jesus has only turned 1 year older. So there's a time difference of all these stories of angels and go to heaven and you live forever. We start to see a scale of scientific purpose to say we can prove that the farther out, just like the astronauts on the space shuttles, their watches start to slow down the further out that they go. It's very possible to say that being on another planet whose solar orbit is much more of a longevity than ours, you could have an increased lifespan. But the payoff for that would be, again, 1 year on Nibiru is 3,600 of our years. So you go on to Nibiru and you're like, woohoo, party for a year. And you come back and it's been 3,600 years on Earth. So very interesting information that they describe of how Nibiru initially interacted with our solar system, whacked our planet, creating half a planet, as you saw there, which leads to another tale of what we would call Pangea, because it's known through science that at one point all the continents were connected. Kind of like the skin of an apple is just kind of peeled off, but at one point the continents were all one landmass and have kind of moved to where they all are. Well, if it was just one landmass, what's the other side? Where's the missing chunk? So it's very interesting to see that all planets spherically come into that form, but when put together like a puzzle, it really was just one chunk of land. And we can see how the Sumerian information describing how our Earth was whacked into half a planet, this theory starts to make sense. Water just siphons into a spherical form around our continents. So interesting information. And there's our good old half-planet Earth. Yes, so here's the orbit of Nibiru, and you can see, again, all of the other planets' orbits. Nibiru has a much more elongated orbit, which makes it very hard for us to track and identify. Now, the information does take a tail into modern knowledge, where there was, in the early 80s, we had a spark where Zecharia Sitchin, this linguist who's been learning about the Sumerian culture and knowledge of Nibiru and the Anunnaki, went to the Naval Observatory in Washington and met with the lead scientist, Dr. Robert Harrington. This was in the early 80s. And they plotted orbital calculations for the Nibiru, which we see here, and all the information and diagrams that we have, and a modern planet X for what they would call an intruder planet that could have caused why Uranus is tilted on its side. What's causing the outer planets to be pulled in a certain direction? And they said it was a planet X. X meaning unknown, but also 10th, something beyond Pluto. So they started to do orbital calculations that showed that there's something out there pulling on the outer planets, but they don't know what it is. They don't see it. So there's got to be some large mass out there yet unidentified. Now, in modern times, we've had all types of information come out over the last few years, a resurgence of interest in the idea of a body beyond Pluto, a 10th planet. They've gone ahead and already wrapped it up. Hey, there's a 10th planet, we're done. No, you're not. There's been a lot of information that comes out of modern sources saying that this little chunk of ice, a Sedna, a Quoar, a Xena, has been found and is the 10th planet. The Sumerian depictions of Nibiru is a planet 4 to 8 times the size of Earth. Very large. Not a little 800 diameter chunk of ice floating beyond Pluto. So if Nibiru is ever to be found or seen, just like the Sumerians depicted it as a large glowing cross in the sky, it will be a very visual event that amateur and professional astronomers will not be able to turn away from. So what took place, again, in the early 80s is Dr. Harrington and Zacharias Sitchin compared their orbital models for the NASA 10th planet and the ancient Planet X. And very interestingly enough, this is nothing new that we see all throughout the last decade, new technologies being launched into space, new telescopes, the SIRTIF, Hubble, various imaging technologies that are allowing us to peer deeper and deeper into space and start to look for something called extrasolar planets. Maybe even some that exist in our own solar system. And we have reports all throughout news, a new far-out peer is found, a 10th planet. This information has been coming out in modern science terms to collaborate that there is possibly something out there that we still have yet to find. Now, if we do find this planet, it's very interesting that we could have ancestors that live on that planet. So utilizing the latest technology that we have to search and peer through the veil of space, I actually met with the lead astronomer for the SIRTIF project, and her name's Dr. Michelle Fowler, and I asked her point blank, is there any possibility that the SIRTIF would be able to see something like a Planet X in our own solar system, a planet 4 to 8 times the size of Earth? She said, yes, and it is possible that something like that does exist on a very elliptical retrograde orbit, but we haven't seen it yet. Now, this type of telescope would be able to image that, but it has to be focused in a very specific area. You can't just flip it on and, oh, there it is up there. So there's a lot of technology that is aiding us now to start to look into the heavens and find things that we didn't know existed. As an example, what you're seeing here is in the top right corner, the visual light spectrum, but then you can see the different light modes that we get out of SIRTIF by using advanced infrared astronomy that can basically, SIRTIF is a telescope out in space that is kept below sub-zero temperatures. It's a super-cooled telescope, and it basically is able to penetrate the veil of coldness in space where there's these massive dust layers that they weren't able to see through. Well, the SIRTIF can tune itself to the temperature of these, this dust and see right through it and give us crystal clear clarity of, for instance, galaxies where all those little dots you see are suns. Those are all suns that you see active that could have planets around them. So the SIRTIF gives us details and information that is very interesting information. But it also starts to lead conjecture to new theories, which the Sumerians have been saying all along. Here's something that's been recently prognosticated for how our moon got here. They call it the Orpheus theory. An intruder planet whacks our primitive Earth, and the debris coalesces to form our moon. Wow, that sounds oddly similar to the Sumerian descriptions of Nibiru coming in and whacking our primitive Earth and creating the asteroid belt. And here we have it called the Orpheus theory, and you can look that up. So one of the little things that I like to point out on the mathematical level is we see here the distance between the planets of their orbits. Well, from Mars and Jupiter, where the asteroid belt is, there's clearly enough room for another large planet to have a free orbit within that area.